Ancient Egyptians made mummies not out of curiosity or tradition, but out of fear. Fear of death, fear of disappearance, and fear of losing eternity. For them, the human body was not something to abandon after death. It was essential. Without it, the soul could not survive. Mummification was not about honoring the dead. It was about keeping them alive forever. Egyptians believed that a person was made of many parts, and the body was the anchor that held everything together. The Ka, the life force, needed to recognize and return to its physical form. The Ba, the personality, traveled freely but had to reunite with the body each night. If the body decayed or was destroyed, this reunion would fail. The soul would become lost, restless, or erased completely. Nature itself taught Egyptians this lesson. In the hot desert sand, bodies buried naturally were preserved. Flesh dried instead of rotting. Bones remained intact. Egyptians saw this and understood that preservation meant survival. Over time, they tried to control the process. What began as natural preservation became ritual science. Mummification was expensive and complex. Not everyone could afford it. The poor received simple burials, while the wealthy underwent long, carefully controlled procedures. The process took around 70 days. Every step followed religious rules passed down for centuries. Mistakes were dangerous. A poorly prepared body could doom the soul forever. The internal organs were removed because they decayed quickly. The brain was extracted through the nose and discarded. It was not considered important. The heart, however, was left inside. Egyptians believed the heart held memory, morality, and identity. It would be weighed during judgment. Without it, there could be no afterlife. The body was dried using natron, a natural salt, drawing out all moisture. This prevented decay and preserved shape. After drying, the body was cleaned, anointed with oils, and wrapped in linen. Each layer of wrapping was accompanied by prayers and spells meant to protect the deceased. The mummy was not just preserved flesh. It was a sacred object. Amulets were placed between the wrappings to guard against danger in the afterlife. Each had a specific purpose: protection, strength, rebirth, or silence during judgment. Nothing was random. Everything served survival beyond death. Mummification was also a social statement. To be properly preserved meant status, respect, and preparation. It showed that the deceased had lived correctly, honored the gods, and deserved eternity. To modern eyes, mummies seem strange or disturbing. To ancient Egyptians, they were reassurance. As long as the body remained intact, hope remained. Death was not an ending, but only if the body endured. And so, Egyptians did not ask whether they should preserve the dead. They believed they had no choice. Without mummies, there was no eternity. The fear of decay haunted ancient Egyptians more than death itself. Rotting flesh meant spiritual failure. It meant the Ka would return and find nothing. It meant the Ba would wander without rest. To decay was to be erased. This terror explains the obsession with perfect preservation. Every crack in the skin, every missing limb, was a potential disaster for eternity. Priests who performed mummification were not craftsmen alone. They were ritual specialists. They wore masks of Anubis, the god of embalming and protector of the dead. Their work was sacred and dangerous. If they failed, they risked divine punishment. Each cut, each wrapping, Each prayer followed strict tradition. The body was treated not as a corpse, but as a future divine being. The process itself mirrored the myth of Osiris, the god who was killed, dismembered, and restored to life. By preserving the body, Egyptians believed they were reenacting this sacred resurrection. Every mummy was a symbolic Osiris. Death was not random. It followed a divine pattern that could be repeated. Social inequality followed the dead into the afterlife. The wealthy could afford full mummification, decorated coffins, tombs filled with food, furniture, and servants in miniature form. The poor often received partial preservation, or simple burials in sand. Yet even the poorest Egyptians hoped that some form of preservation would be enough. Eternity was unequal, but hope was universal. Mummies were not meant to be seen. Once sealed in tombs, they were hidden forever. Their purpose was not memory, but function. Statues, names, and inscriptions preserved identity, while the mummy preserved existence. If a name was erased or a statue destroyed, the soul could die a second death. This is why names were carved in stone, to protect them from time itself. Animals were also mummified. Cats, birds, crocodiles, and bulls were preserved as offerings to the gods or symbols of divine presence. This shows how deeply Egyptians believed in preservation as a bridge between worlds. Life, whether human or animal, could continue if properly prepared. Over centuries, mummification became more widespread. Techniques improved, rituals evolved, and beliefs spread beyond royalty. What began as a royal necessity became a cultural obsession. To die unprepared was shameful. To rot was terrifying. Yet mummification was never about denying death. Egyptians accepted death as inevitable. What they rejected was oblivion. To be forgotten, to dissolve, to vanish. This was the true horror. Preservation was resistance against nothingness. Even today, mummies still lie in silence, fulfilling their ancient purpose. Their skin, bones, and wrappings have endured far longer than anyone expected. In a way, the ancient Egyptians were right. Preservation defeated time. In the end, mummies exist because the ancient Egyptians believed life was too precious to end. Every wrapping was a promise. Every ritual was an act of defiance against death, and every mummy was a declaration that existence could continue. If the body remained, the soul would follow. The obsession with preservation also shaped how Egyptians lived while still alive. From childhood, people were taught that their actions would echo beyond death. The body they cared for every day was not temporary. It was a vessel meant to last forever. Cleanliness, ritual purity, and respect for the flesh were part of spiritual survival. Mummification was only one stage of a much larger system. Tombs were constructed as eternal homes. Walls were covered with scenes of daily life, so the soul could recognize and repeat them. Farming, hunting, eating, and celebration were carved into stone, so they would never disappear. Life itself was frozen in place, made permanent. Magic played a critical role. Amulets were placed between the wrappings to protect specific parts of the body. The heart scarab guarded the soul during judgment. The Jed pillar symbolized stability of the spine. The Eye of Horus ensured healing and completeness. Each object had a function. Nothing was decorative. Everything had a purpose in eternity. The final ritual, the opening of the mouth, was believed to restore the senses. Without it, the mummy would be blind, deaf, and mute in the afterlife. This ceremony allowed the dead to eat, speak, and breathe again. Death was not the end of function. It was a transition requiring careful activation. Even mistakes in mummification could doom the soul. A broken limb, poor wrapping, or missing organ was not just physical damage, it was metaphysical risk. This fear led families to invest everything they had to ensure correctness. Death could bankrupt the living, but failure was unthinkable. Grave robbing was one of the greatest crimes imaginable. It was not theft, it was spiritual murder. Destroying a mummy or stealing burial goods threatened the soul's survival.
This is why curses were written on tombs, not as superstition, but as legal and divine warnings. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell, the belief endured. Even when foreign rulers controlled Egypt, mummification continued. The practice outlived dynasties, languages, and gods. It became identity itself. To be Egyptian was to believe that death was only temporary. Decay was the real enemy. Ironically, many mummies survived precisely because they were forgotten. Hidden beneath sand and stone, they escaped war, fire, and destruction. Their silence protected them. Time passed, civilizations vanished, but the preserved bodies remained, waiting. Today, we see mummies as relics. The ancient Egyptians saw them as guarantees. Guarantees that life would resume, that identity would remain intact, that the universe could be trusted to restore what was carefully prepared. Mummification was not a morbid fascination with death. It was an act of extreme optimism. It assumed the future mattered. It assumed existence was worth protecting at any cost. And that is why ancient Egyptians made mummies. Not because they feared dying, but because they believed with absolute certainty that life was meant to continue.